only child, an adored son, he lived quietly with his mother in a small market town.
He would pick out a victim, bend down on one knee, take aim, fire, and then move on to the next victim.
He was a sullen, self-centred boy who was often teased at school. He grew up to be besotted with guns and the feeling of power and control that they gave him.
Seeing the body bags coming out from down the bottom of the road and being put into the vehicles and taken away still didn't seem real.
Dressed in combat gear, he went on a killing spree in his own hometown. He destroyed everyone who crossed his path.
It's hard to deal with, even as a forensic pathologist. All of these people killed so suddenly in one particular place.
Tonight, we get inside the mind of Michael Ryan, one of Britain's most notorious spree killers, in the making of a monster. We've all heard so much about the murderers, rapists and paedophiles who grab the front pages, those whose crimes are so appalling that they seem to exert a strange fascination. As a forensic psychologist, I've spent the last 10 years analysing the behaviour of the people behind the headlines. I've worked in prisons and secure units, trying to understand what makes somebody capable of a truly monstrous act of violence. Tonight's story really has the power to shock. It involves one of the biggest spree killings that this country has ever experienced.
To try to unravel the psychological profiles of dangerous convicts, Kerry has spent a decade researching and interviewing the most violent killers and criminals in Britain. Tonight, she examines a truly horrific case. It involves one of the biggest mass murders that this country has ever experienced.
The shock of such a large number of people being mown down by gunfire in a town so quiet and so English has stayed with many for years. Here to discuss the case with me tonight are Dr. David Holmes, a fellow forensic psychologist, and Mark Williams-Thomas, one of the country's top criminologists and a former detective. But first, let's find out more about the crime. It was market day in Hungerford, a warm Wednesday, the 19th of August, 1987. The schools were on holiday and lots of people were out taking advantage of the good weather. But this small town in Berkshire was about to become the setting for one of the biggest mass murders in recent British history. Just after midday, Michael Ryan entered a secluded area of Sevenock Forest. He found a mother and her 2 children having a picnic lunch. He ordered the mother to walk with him into the woods. He shot her 13 times. Her children heard the sounds of the shots being fired and were terrified.
The most obvious explanation was that this was a rape that had gone terribly wrong. That she had struggled, or he had changed his mind and panicked, but he shot her, and that was the first of the killings of that day, and unfortunately not the last.
Next, Ryan went to a petrol station and filled up his car. He then went to the boot and brought out a semi-automatic rifle. He began shooting and stormed into the shop, aiming his rifle at the owner. He pulled the trigger twice, but both times the rifle failed to fire. At around 12:45, Ryan arrived at his next destination, South View, where he lived with his widowed mother. Seeing 2 of his neighbours, he began shooting. Both died instantly.
I heard glass breaking and my son came running in and he said, "Oh, Mum, please come and help. Lisa's been hurt." Now Lisa, it turned out, was the youngest victim of the Hungerford massacre, and she'd been shot 4 times. I remember staunching the flow of blood because the bullet took an artery out of her leg and she lost 3 pints of blood.
He didn't appear to be incredibly hyped up. He was very controlled, fairly calm, very methodical. He would pick out a victim, bend down on one knee, take aim, fire, and then move on to the next victim.
As Ryan jogged up and down the road, he continued to shoot at anything that moved.
Seeing the body bags coming out from down the bottom of the road and being put into the vehicles and taken away, it still didn't seem real. And I remember one of the children dropping the loo seat and we all jumped. And I still thought, no, this can't be happening, you know.
It was 1:13. In little over an hour, Ryan had already killed 9 people, and it wasn't to end there. At this point, his mother Dorothy returned home from shopping. She found houses on fire, people lying dead in their gardens, and smashed cars lining the street. Dorothy then saw her son with a gun in his hand and called out for him to stop. He ignored her pleas and coldly pulled the trigger. Dr. Richard Shepherd is a Home Office pathologist who was called to the scene to examine many of the dead bodies, including that of Dorothy Ryan.
She was shot 3 times. She was shot first in the leg, which disabled her, caused her to fall to the ground. She was lying face down on the ground, and she was shot then twice in the back, one from a reasonable distance, and one as a final execution shot from very close range.
Despite the police helicopter hovering above him and telling him to lay down his weapons, Ryan coolly walked away.
It was almost as if he was waiting for his mother to come back. Once she had been killed, then he was able to leave Southview and travel around the rest of Hungerford.
He crossed the children's playground, firing randomly. He was oblivious to anything other than his hell-bent mission to kill everyone in his path.
He killed a huge number of people, injured many more, caused absolute havoc. The scene was like something out of a war zone. Cars crashed into lampposts, buildings on fire. Yeah, it was something that we'd never seen in this country.
Shortly before 2 p.m, Ryan walked slowly, with his head down, and into the local secondary school, the one he'd attended as a boy. At 5:26 p.m, the police spotted him at a third-floor classroom window. Police surrounded the building and tried to persuade him to surrender. Ryan's first victim was shot at about 12:47 p.m, and the last at 1:45 p.m. In the space of 58 minutes, 16 people were murdered and 15 lay injured. David, if we just start by differentiating between a spree killer and a serial killer.
A spree killer and serial killer are quite easily distinguished. One is much more rapid. A spree killer is fairly quick, and you can have a distinct sort of like serial killer where a large cooling off period occurs of, say, months and weeks, but the problem I have with using the term spree killer in this case is that I think it's very close to what we call a mass killer, where a large number of people are often killed around the same time in the same place. Some spree killers kind of fall in between. And this one falls very heavily towards the mass killer in that it's done within the same day rather than over a period of time, and there's no escape.
Within an hour?
Yes.
16 dead and 15 injured within an hour.
I would very clearly define it as being a spree killer. And the spree killer fits into the fact that he was random in his targeting, and he was massively random because he would shoot people, pick different targets over different places, but they all occurred on the same day in approximately the same locality, so it didn't separate them by days, whereas a serial killer will be 3 or more people over a period of time separated by days.
Would you agree, though, that Ryan was completely random, or do you think that actually there was an element of choice to who he got shot at?
I don't think any killer is absolutely random. It is random as to who you're going to come up against, who you're going to find, but it is not random as to whether or not you actually kill that person or wait for another. But also, in the case of Ryan, he could have wandered off to a situation where it was mostly strangers, but he chose instead to make that one turning and say, I'm going to actually look towards people that I know, my own neighbours, people that I have got, actual connections with. And he chose that particular path. Now, it kind of could be global, it could be looked on as, well, it was a random choice, but in terms of his particular predilections, if we're going to presume he had any, he did choose familiar people over unfamiliar people, but they were chosen, obviously, at random as he came across them.
Some people have said, and this doesn't hold any water with me, in actual fact it's possible that Michael Ryan did not set out to be a spree killer on that day. Some people have suggested that maybe his first victim should have been a victim of rape, and that's what he intended to do, but he killed her, and having killed one person suddenly, he realised his situation was dire, and it was easier to kill other people. What do you think of that, Mark?
I think the problem with this, and this goes back to the point of trying to understand why he committed his crimes. I mean, I'm not sure we can understand why he committed his crimes. So clearly his first offence against this woman was a strange act. He took her out, took her away into a field, took to a location and committed an offence against her. Now, he didn't commit a rape against her, he didn't commit a sexual offence against her. He then returned home in order to
build up his arsenal and then went wandering after that. Now, whether he'd intended to do that, it would seem rather strange why he would return home and why he hadn't set out, if he'd set out previously to kill, just to go straight from her to go and kill other people. But again, we're trying to understand the mind of an individual which is irrational and who is behaving in a non-conformist point. And I'm not sure we can do that.
Well, you say irrational. David, there was actually, as you said, there's an element of choice to where he went.
I wouldn't use the term irrational in the case, particularly of this kind of killer, because I think they show an awful lot more foresight than, say, serial killers, who really don't have very much of a plan for the future. Whereas these people do often know what the conclusion is going to be before they set out. They are often pre-prepared, their armaments are usually
Irrational and still choose your victim.
The problem is that most killers of this type do not usually indulge in rape, assault. They usually simply kill, and it's usually with a lethal weapon such as a gun or occasionally a knife. And they don't engage in other criminal activity of robbery or anything else during this. So it would be out of character if that was his intent.
The problem we have, of course, is we have two spree killers. We have Hungerford and we have Dunblane, which are our two spree killings. Serial killers, well, there are a number of serial killers, so we have two cases of which to try and put logic and try and explain where their behaviour comes from. Very difficult.
Well, of course, the questions are always going to outweigh the answers, because the other great characteristic of spree killers is that they tend to kill themselves, don't they, at the end of the spree? Why is that?
Well, for me, it actually shows foresight. The thing is, and it sounds strangely irrational on my part, but I actually attribute more planning and foresight to spree mass killers than I do to serial killers, because they don't seem to have a plan for their future, whereas the spree killer will decide often in advance that the only conclusion to this is probably their own death. But if you look to most serial killers, they eventually come to a very similar conclusion, but often after they're caught in prison, they decide they can't face what is coming towards them, which is long-term imprisonment, and commit suicide.
But I accept that, but also I think we have to be very clear that actually spree killing is about use of guns, in both these circumstances. A serial killer, I can't think of a serial killer that's used guns and gone out and killed people from a serial point of view, and therefore the end result is far more difficult to come by. Whereas in a spree killing, you just shoot yourself and you end it. So of course I think that's significant. And again, we've only got two cases to go by. Yes, both of them killed themselves, and we can look to America, who obviously have got a number of spree killers that have occurred. But the end result is they shoot themselves because that's what they've done to everybody else.
So we can't ask them questions because obviously they're dead. I think you make a good point though, David, in that actually a lot of people think of these spree killings as spontaneous eruptions of violence, but I don't think that actually any act of violence isn't rehearsed in some way, even if it's just through some sort of macho fantasies. And it seems to me that Ryan actually spent an awful lot of time, engaged and immersed in his fantasy world.
I think he did. He had an awful lot of practice prior to the day. And I mean, the kind of weaponry, the choice of weaponry, which he was able to carry around with no difficulty and reload with very little difficulty, he carried around with approximately the amount of ammunition he would need. He didn't just randomly pick up guns that were half empty. It was kind of pre-planned. And I think a lot of this probably did stem from fantasies that had been running through his head as he progressed through his life and through this kind of like pseudo-military existence that he managed to create for himself, a fantasy that was actually even supported by his mother in some context.
Well, I think we need to talk more about Ryan's mother, and we need to talk more about his fantasy world. After the break, we'll take a look at the man behind the headlines. Any type of murder is ugly, but murder for no apparent reason is truly horrific. Michael Ryan's killing spree was vicious and apparently without motive. So, what kind of person commits a crime like this? Hungerford, a small market town in Berkshire, was the home of Michael Robert Ryan, an only child who was born on the 18th of May, 1960. His father was a government building inspector and was known as a perfectionist. He was 55 when Ryan was born. His mother was 20 years younger than her husband.
She was a really lovely lady, worked at the school and just generally chatted.
Mr. and Mrs. Ryan were well known and popular members of the community.
His parents were respectable working class, certainly not from a broken home or anything like that. By all accounts, his parents were devoted to him. He was very close to his father, but his father died, and I think that's probably an important factor in a number of spree killing cases.
Michael Ryan grew up in South View, and neighbours remembered him as a quiet, sullen, self-centred boy.
I think he probably was really spoilt as being an only child and that. Michael wouldn't make eye contact with you, he kept himself to himself, and if you wanted a conversation with him, you'd have to initiate it yourself and that. And the longest conversation I had with him was about 2 minutes.
He went to school at the John O'Gaunt Secondary School, but didn't shine academically or socially.
We do know that throughout Michael Ryan's life, he had trouble forming relationships, and this extended to sexual relationships. It could be that the whole trigger for this was that botched rape, and that was born of the frustration of not having the social skills to meet people.
From an early age, he was fascinated with all things military. His favourite toy was Action Man, the military-type plastic doll kitted out with uniforms and weapons. This enthusiasm continued well into adulthood.
One of the interesting things about this obsession is it's built around this very extreme vision of what it is to be a man. I mean, it's all about masculinity. And for someone like Michael Ryan, who was in many ways not a very successful man, not a man able to kind of make his way in the world, this reliance on weapons to enhance this feeling of masculinity is very important.
Michael Ryan was a lonely man who sought refuge in a world of fantasy. He claimed to have been befriended by an army colonel who was giving him flying lessons and would buy him a Ferrari sports car.
This fits in with this idea of him looking for some father figure, some masculine figure that would kind of take him under his wing, and I think it's significant in the fact that his father had gone. So here was somebody else that he conjured up to take that place, and again it was significant that it wasn't someone in any other walk of life, it was somebody in the military.
But this passion with all things military went beyond fantasy. He joined a gun club, bought army jackets, survival gear and masks. He even persuaded the police to grant him a licence to own powerful firearms.
He was very, very into survivalism, and survivalism as a philosophy, and he had huge amounts of ex-NATO equipment. He had an AK-47 machine gun, an M1 carbine, he had Israeli grenades. I mean, the kind of equipment that you don't normally get outside of an army.
We can't ask Michael Ryan what triggered the events of that fateful day, but is there any clue in his background as to what caused the Hungerford massacre? David, what do you think of his being a mummy's boy?
He was a loner, he was a bit of a mummy's boy.
He was a lot of a mummy's boy, wasn't he?
He was, to some degree, protected by his mother, he was supported by his mother, he was even supported by his mother in some of the lies and the fantasies that he created, which is very disturbing, really. But he also had the other characteristics. He was bullied, and he didn't react very well to that. He tended to sort of shy away, and obviously was probably building up a certain amount of resentment. So there was a lot of the kind of early triggers. I think he resented his mum. You get something called aggressive dependency, where somebody makes you dependent on them. You don't wish to continue that throughout your life, particularly as you become an adult and need to stand up for yourself. And then, of course, you resent them for having those apron strings wrapped around you, so tightly.
Also, something that I found was, because I've worked with quite a few clients who seemingly have erupted with no other history of violence, and quite often these have, overly involved relationships with the mothers, but something that I've noticed is that they don't seem to have been able to develop an identity of their own, so they create one. And I don't think Ryan really fully knew himself, and I don't think he could really relate to other people, could he? Do you think that he saw other people as objects?
It is the only way that he could actually deliver what he did deliver on that day. He had to regard these people as not particularly being human beings. He did indiscriminately start shooting at objects, at cars. He would shoot the person, then he would shoot the car. David, his shooting at the cars was the fact that he was using a machine gun, and could. And it would penetrate, and it killed those things. But I think, to say that he shot people thinking that they were objects, not thinking that they were objects, but he had to regard them as being objects that moved, not as real sentient people that he may have cared about and had relationships with, because at that point he would have had to
Isn't that why he killed them? Because he knew who they were?
I think not. I think he regarded these people as people that he envied, and he wanted to regard them as objects. He didn't want to think of them as being sentient.
he either envied them or he felt they were objects. Surely it's one or the other.
No, I think he envied them to the point where he wanted to put a certain layer of hatred over them, and I resent you having a nice normal life, you were nice.
So he identified with them as individuals.
In order to actually get behind this machinery, become this almost like a character out of a computer game that had no feelings or anything, he objectified other people.
So if he saw them as an object, he saw them as a target.
He saw them as a target.
He was known, actually, to shoot at birds, and he was also known to take pot shots at neighbours. Let's talk about, actually, what impact having a weapon does have. I mean, it gave Ryan probably the only bit of power that he had in his life, really.
He did, and it was a ludicrously weighted amount of power because there was no one in that town who could do anything about it. When you drafted someone in, because of legislation and because of regulations, the police marksman couldn't access his own weapon, and therefore, literally, Michael Ryan ruled the roost in the area because there was no one else with a weapon that could oppose him.
But Michael Ryan held a gun not for the basis of culture to enable him to have status amongst his fellows. That wasn't why he had a gun. He had a gun because he could get a gun. He could easily have a gun, and it was his way of enjoyment. You know, he didn't have anything else in his life.
Did it run a bit deeper than that? Because actually, and I think he was heard to comment a few times about the power that it gave to him. We're talking about somebody who is apparently inadequate. Socially inadequate, no friends, nobody wants to talk to him, not that he's particularly obnoxious.
I'm not sure we can make any comparison between him having a gun and the way that people have guns now, because people have guns now about power, social issues, in order to say, I can have a gun and I can threaten somebody else and I can get, you know, a lot of it is drugs and all that. He had a gun because his aspect of having a gun was his enjoyment. You know, he could put himself into this fantasy world.
To compensate for his inadequacies, surely.
Yes, to compensate for his inadequacies, but those inadequacies weren't in relation to peers to be able to get further up the ladder. They were just simply in the fact that he either couldn't communicate and couldn't put himself into the same level without any problems.
So, why did he shoot his dog? Apparently he said that he shot his dog with his eyes closed. It seems that actually he had more empathy for the dog than any of the people that he shot.
I think this is possibly an indicator of his disproportionate affiliation, where he viewed the world. The dog was possibly a grade or two above his mother, and to some extent, even though he had quite a keyed-in relationship with his mother. But to some degree, each one will have become an object at the point where he had to kill them, because that is the only way he could pull the trigger. And to some degree, if you think he killed his dog, he killed his mother, he killed people he knew, this begins to look like a fairly protracted suicide, because there's no point, if you are going to kill yourself, in leaving other elements of your life alive, because it's going to end anyway.
But he also set fire to the house, of course. So really, there was nothing left of the Ryan household at all by the time he'd finished.
At the end of the day, there was going to be nothing left of Michael Ryan as far as he was concerned, and that was the end product, I think.
Well, unfortunately, we can't ask Michael Ryan what was running through his head on that day. After the break, we'll take a look at Dunblane and another case in the US that might shed some light on spree killing. Every few years, a crime is committed that's so momentous that it leaves an indelible mark on the whole nation. The Hungerford Massacre changed Britain. Crimes of this type are exceptionally rare, but not unique. So what, if anything, do spree killers have in common, and what could trigger a crime of this nature? The Hungerford Massacre was rivalled only by the Dunblane Massacre about 10 years later. Its perpetrator was Thomas Hamilton. Hamilton was known as Mr. Creepy by the boys of Dunblane, Scotland, a village 40 miles from Edinburgh.
Thomas Hamilton was a person who had two great interests in life: small boys and guns. He displayed all of the kind of behavioural traits of a predatory paedophile.
He started up a number of scout groups throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He often rented out or borrowed space at local schools or gymnasiums, where he organised a wide range of club activities.
By most people's standards, Thomas Hamilton was a very odd individual. In his early 20s, he'd worked as a scout leader, and he'd taken some of the scouts away on trips, promising them accommodation, but eventually the boys ended up sleeping in vans. This happened on 2 occasions, and that was the end of his career as a scout leader. He then thought society was out to get him, or the authorities were out to get him, displaying what I think we lay people would term paranoia.
He then set up his own children's clubs, but membership rapidly declined because of his increasingly strange behaviour. On the morning of March 13th, 1996, Thomas Hamilton left his home at 7 Kent Road with only one thing on his mind: At 9:30 he drove to the local primary school with a pair of pliers, 4 handguns and more than 700 rounds of ammunition. Once there, he burst into the hall where a class of children were having a gym lesson and opened fire.
Because of his preoccupation with running clubs for young boys, Thomas Hamilton actually had access to school premises, and in fact, one of his 9-year-old boys recounts that Thomas Hamilton used to ask him about school timetables and about movements of pupils in the school.
He systematically slaughtered 16 children and their teacher. During the rampage, another teacher and a dozen other students were wounded.
When the police arrived at Dunblane Primary School, it was described as a medieval vision of hell.
Surrounded by bodies of the dead and dying, 43-year-old Hamilton turned the gun on himself and put a bullet through his brain.
I personally can't see how Thomas Hamilton ever thought he would walk out of that school alive. He was going in there, he was killing numerous of society's most vulnerable people. He knew there would be an armed police response. It's my opinion that he always intended to kill himself after he carried out his dreadful crimes.
Massacres of this scale hardly ever happen in Britain, but in America they're on the increase. The Columbine High School massacre happened just 2 years later, and again involved a mass shooting of young people.
Columbine was very different, and even in the United States where spree killings are much more common, it was a real shock. It raised lots of questions about what's going on in American society, not just to do with gun control, but about what's going on with young men.
On the morning of the 20th of April 1999, 2 students walked into their high school in West Denver, Colorado, armed with guns, bombs and grenades.
It had a bigger impact in the United States than many of the other spree killings that have happened before or since.
At first it was thought that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were 2 depressed teenagers carrying out an act of revenge, but it was soon discovered that they'd been planning it for over a year.
It became clear that it was their intention to go down in history as spree killers. And when you look at the events of that morning, it seems clear that their preparation was almost military. They'd gone to the school armed with a number of high-powered firearms. They'd also taken homemade bombs and incendiary devices.
In just 16 minutes, they shot and killed 13 of their fellow students, together with 1 teacher. Another 23 people were injured. Harris and Klebold then took their own lives.
One of the advantages we have here is that we've been able to interview a number of the survivors from the Columbine massacre, and the stories they tell are really bizarre. The killers were walking around smiling. They were challenged by a student and asked what they were doing, and one of them replied, "Oh, we're just killing people." A number of their schoolmates survived and must be suffering unimaginable trauma for years after the occurrence.
In both of the examples we've just seen, the massacres took place in schools. Maybe this is just where large numbers of people congregate, or is there something more relevant to that choice of location? David, do you think that the choice of schools as a location for a spree killing is relevant?
It can be relevant, and certainly a lot of the kind of early conflicting forced relationships are usually during your school years, you know, and these die down a lot when you go into the world of employment. So for these individuals, schools will be like little hotbeds of places where deep feelings about bullying or resentment or hating others would probably emanate from.
I think quite simply in relation to Dunblane, in relation to America, the majority of the people who actually commit the spree killings are students at universities and schools.
Why is that?
Why are they students? Well, they've got to a point in their life, you know, they feel that actually spree killings, going to kill mass people is something they want to do. I'm not sure I understand why they do it, but the reason it's at school is because they are at that school. And in relation to Dunblane, the reason that he went to a school was the people that he were making allegations against him, and the people that were accusing him in relation to the indecent offences were children. And that's why he went to the school, to execute those children.
It seems that something that ties all of these cases together is that you've got somebody who is incredibly isolated, and as you've already touched upon, who is resentful of a particular group, if not the world.
I think the resentment builds up, and one of the things, particularly in the American, is you have loners, people that don't associate with others, which allows these fantasy worlds to be built up. You know, if you do enter a school, you're going to enter a place which is teeming with people who are going to be your instant inferiors because you have weapons and they certainly will not in a school. The
problem is, in relation to spree killings in the UK, you can't take two cases and say, well, this is why spree killers behave in this way, because there's only two cases we can use. In America, I think that they have considerably more, and I think there's an element of culture. I think there's an element of cult status, why these people commit these offences, copycat killings, identity. And I think it's far easier if you draw analysis of why those commit offences, rather than looking at Hungerford and Dunblane, because they are so exceptional in their way. These people behave in a way that we can't put common sense to.
So America does have a massive problem, doesn't it, with teenage spree killers? Why? What is that all about? Is it about revenge? Or is it about, as Mark's already touched upon, cult status? About having the highest number of killings to your name?
Over the last sort of 15, 20 years, you have got a build-up of fantasy worlds that have been created often by video games, which are almost always shoot 'em up type games, where these kids begin to blur the boundary between what is killing on a computer game and what is killing in real life. So the idea of getting a very high score, you can probably see the connection.
Spree killings, they're not common in America. The size of America is massive. There are a number of cases that we know about. If you make a
enough of the
comparison...
problem that actually there's a huge amount of money being pumped into research in schools to try and make schools more inclusive so that children value each other, so you don't get these lowers. So it must be a significant problem.
Spree killings aren't to a penny in America. Serial killers in America are to a penny. There's a serial killer in every single state, and many of them. But spree killings not. And I think when you look at the gun crime culture over in America, everyone has got access to a gun in America, but they don't have access to a gun over here. So they've got the opportunity to be able to commit the offences. And spree killings over there, we hear about them, but we hear about them because they are so rare.
And it is interesting, perhaps, to look at these particular cases, whereby perhaps with Hamilton there would be almost inevitably more crimes. He had committed crimes, and there would be more crimes, and they may have escalated. He may have strangled, he may have done all sorts, he may have been a serial killer prior to a spree like this. Whereas, unfortunately, with Michael Ryan, you don't have that. Although they're completely different people, aren't they? I mean, we have someone here in Ryan where you could never have predicted it, apart from examining him in a slightly different way to how we normally would examine by police work. Now, with police work, you look at people who have committed offences. So with Hamilton, you would find offences. You would find incidents with children. With Ryan, you would not.
But that has never actually been proven.
No,
it's been alluded to, but it's never actually been proven. So we don't know that he was necessarily having hands-on contact with boys.
The indicators would have kind of come to almost the threshold of almost being crimes, notable at least. Things that could have had consequences.
They were certainly uncomfortable with him, and he put himself in a position where he had kids around him the whole time.
Yes, but don't you think that some of that was about the fact that kids are more malleable and he wanted to live out his fantasies? A lot of the activities he was involved with the children were macho, gung-ho, boys together, combat type activities.
Very much a kind of fantasist, very much a kind of, sexually orientated fantasist, where he's sort of military and sexual sort of oppression has been very much part of the same syndrome. And he wanted to be, as it were, a sadistic military person, if you like.
Well, both himself and Ryan, I admit that they are both very, very different people, but they've both got this underlying machismo, haven't they? Yeah. How relevant is that? I mean, we've got no cases at all that I know of, certainly not here because we've only had two, but in the USA of females being involved in a spree killing.
I think you're right. I think definitely there is, there is a sex difference in crime. What we view as criminals is always a male image, and most of the crimes are committed by males.
If you look at serial killers, there's three female serial killers, Beverly Allitt, Rose West, and Mara Hinley.
And there's more in America.
And considering on America, having guns and things like that is very much a male aspect. If you buy a gun magazine, you don't see females carrying guns around in them. It's very much a male-dominated area, and therefore that's what draws men into it, rather than from the female aspect. And in serial killers, from a female's point of view, you tend to get those females who are drawn into it from a male point of view.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, and I think I'd go as far as to say it's a male brain type thing. It's weaponry, military views, the idea of being invincible, of being a little soldier, almost like on a video screen, to be invulnerable, is a male fantasy and very much a product of a male brain.
Well, I think we need to go back to the case of Ryan. After the break, we'll take a look at the aftermath of the Hungerford massacre. 2 decades ago, a sleepy town was the scene of unprecedented carnage as Michael Ryan ran amok. In the space of just 1 hour, 16 people were shot dead. 15 more lay injured on the streets of Hungerford. As the afternoon wore into the early evening, Ryan remained holed up in the local school.
Eventually he was spotted at the window, and police then tried to keep him calm, tried to kind of negotiate with him in a bid to get him to give up his weapons and give himself up. He didn't want to negotiate that. He was asking about his dog. He was asking about his mother.
Ryan asked the police how he would be treated and how long he would go to prison. They assured him that he would get fair treatment. It said that he berated himself for not having the nerve to commit suicide. Ryan expressed remorse about the death of his mother, and then he made the statement that was to make newspaper and television headlines around the world. He said, "I wish I had stayed in bed."
I think it's an indication that this wasn't a premeditated killing. He may have fantasized about doing all of these things, but he hadn't got up that morning with a definite plan. This was what he was going to do.
A few minutes later, a muffled shot was heard from within the school. At first, none of the officers entered the building. They needed to be certain that this mass murderer was in fact dead.
The police weren't sure whether he'd booby-trapped the school, so there was a delay before the police went in.
At 8:10, police entered a third-floor room where Ryan had been seen. He was found slumped against a wall by a window, dead. At this stage, it was uncertain whether he had committed suicide or had been hit by a police marksman.
The injuries to Michael Ryan were absolutely typical of suicide. He had a gunshot wound in his right temple. Around it was burning and other marks showing that the gun had been close to his head. We recovered a bullet from the opposite wall of the classroom, which matched the bullet that had come out of his gun. So it was quite clear that Michael Ryan had shot himself in the classroom, seated on the ground where we saw him.
His one-man massacre was finally over.
It's hard to deal with, even as a forensic pathologist. All of these people killed so suddenly in one particular place. And I still have within my brain the pictorial images and the emotional images.
Hungerford was a huge shock to the UK. Spree killings, when they happened in the US, or they happened in far-off countries, not in the UK. It was a wake-up call, and it led to not just a change in the gun laws, but a change in perceptions of this country as a whole.
The name Michael Ryan will forever be synonymous with Hungerford. Mark, why is it that when we have serial killers, we remember the name of the killer? When we have spree killers, on the rare occasions that we do, we remember the town, but we never remember any of the victims' names?
I cannot tell you the name of a single victim from a Hungerford massacre or from Dunblane. I can't tell you that. And I can't tell you the victims from the serial killers. Yorkshire Rip, I couldn't tell you any of those victims. And that's because we forget them as individuals, and we remember the individuals who commit the offence and their locality. And that's very sad.
Well, I mean, obviously, the whole community was devastated, wasn't it? What do you think have been the long-term ramifications for Hungerford?
Someone more or less all over the village will have been touched by it in some way or other because of the large number of people that were killed. Plus, the impact of the incident on the town will have made people very, very anxious and nervous, not just for the next few days or a few weeks, but for many, many years into the future. If there is one town, in this country that is going to be, on full alert for anything happening of that nature, it will be Hungerford. It is interesting, of course, with these cases that following them, massive advances are often made in terms of police, communications networks, preparedness, armed response units, guidelines over gun use, etc., are often advanced massively as a consequence of these things. We don't have very much foresight, but we have a massive amount of hindsight. There was no armed response vehicle that came to Hungerford until such time as he was actually into the school. And you can talk exactly the same with Dunblane, albeit he went into the school and committed offences. In the UK now, there'd be an immediate response with an armed response vehicle. Nobody was going to the locality, and indeed people would be shot. I dealt with a case in Surrey where this person was shot. He was in his house, and the armed crew shot him because they suspected he had a gun, and he had a gun, although it was an imitation gun. So the armed response vehicles are there now. So I think with this
direct result from Hungerford, do you think we've learned from past mistakes? Because it was a bodge up, really, wasn't it? The police response to Michael Ryan.
I'm not sure it was a bodge up. It was they dealt with it with the best way that they had at the time. And we've learned massively from Hungerford, we've learned massively from Dunblane, and we've learned massively from other cases, serial killings, young children being killed. We learn every time. I think we also do need to learn another lesson, not just the kind of response, the guideline, having things in place that were missing at the time, but we also need to learn about the psychology of these incidents, because even having, response units and people at the ready, you have to recognise that that situation has happened. And often in these cases, and you can see it, you can see it unfolding at Hungerford, is people did not actually know what was going on. The coordination and realisation and recognition that you have a major incident. It takes a small, sleepy town by total surprise.
Do you think when there's a large number of casualties and a large number of deaths, that delays the grieving process in a way? It's harder for communities to get over an incident like this than maybe, a family or a smaller unit.
Because with a family, there's a lot more focus on the individuals, whereas with Hungerford, it was Hungerford that was grieving, not the individual family. And you say you probably felt a little bit swamped if you're a grieving relative amongst the number of people, and probably felt a little bit humbled that you shouldn't perhaps make too much of a fuss yourself, because you're in the limelight with other people who are suffering, and there was probably a lot more restraint and dignity from the people of Hungerford than there would be had it been one family that was...
The sad reality is when you get more than one victim, more than two victims, how do you cover all those things? And we're talking from a media point of view, which is where we see things portrayed now. You can't go and cover 15 separate families and their funerals, as it were. But of course, in relation to one or two victims, you can do that. So, that has a huge impact on the way we perceive things through the media is sadly the future.
How much, David, do you think that the massacre has become ingrained into Hungerford's identity?
Well, unfortunately, yes, it has. For the entire sort of time the massacre was taking place, it was the name Hungerford that was used. It wasn't the name Michael Ryan, it wasn't the names of the victims, it was the name of the town, and unfortunately it's become, if you like, synonymous with the very first sort of screen mass killing in this country. This is a lot of people. There's a lot of grieving. And for each one of those 16 people, you're going to have 20 people that knew them very closely, or relatives who will have been badly affected by this. So a very large number of people grieving in a very, very small community. And those people, to some degree, will not enjoy it every time that the Hungerford name is drawn up and drawn with the sort of connections with Michael Ryan. But needless to say, the public out there also do not need to forget about this, because if you do forget about this, then all the preparedness, all the ability to sort of spot, and let's face it, it's never going to be a police officer that rings in first to say that something like that is happening. It is going to be a member of the public, and if it ever goes completely out of our consciousness, we may be vulnerable to it happening again.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Mark. Well, the Hungerford massacre will probably live on in the public psyche for many more years. The case of Michael Ryan will always exert a strange fascination. Because of the rarity of spree killing and the nature of the crime, I'll probably never, as a forensic psychologist, get to interview a spree killer. So I'll never fully understand what are the motives behind the actions.